And hello and welcome everyone to this panel on promoting inclusive learning in the workplace. I'm Sam Chandrasekhar, if that's easier. Um, for those of you who attended the plenary session that concluded just a while ago, I had argued that building resilience in the economy is important. And for that, we need to enable inclusive lifelong learning at the workplace. Continuing that strain of thought, we have a panel of 5 assembled here today to deliberate on that topic, promoting inclusive learning in the workplace. Each of us brings different type of expertise and experience with technology, disability, inclusion, and learning in the workplace. And together with you, the audience, we hope to uncover diverse perspectives on this topic. But first, a round of introductions about who we are, where we work, and what we do there, and also a line about what inclusive learning means to us. I'll start off. So I'm Sam Chandrasekhar. I'm the accessibility lead at D2L Corporation. D2L is an education technology company. We make Brightspace, which is an integrated learning platform. Our mission is to create inclusive teaching and learning experiences that don't leave anyone behind. And as the accessibility lead, I work with almost everyone in the company across all functions, supporting them in doing their best work in accessibility. To me, inclusive learning means a learning environment that provides choices, one that is mindful of the inevitable diversity in learning needs, the needs of learners with disabilities, because when we take care of extreme needs, the good impact reaches beyond them. I will now pass the ball to Ainsley.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited about the conversation that we are going to have. Thank you, Dr. Sam, for that lovely introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. I am a white settler, approaching middle age. I have long hair. I'm female, use she, her pronouns. I'm coming to you from my home office, and I am actually the co-founder and president of a brand new organization called Idea STEM. Idea STEM stands for inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and we also like to include healthcare as well. And the goal of this very exciting organization is to really facilitate the inclusion of individuals with disabilities in STEM disciplines, or broadly in science. And we do this not so much with a focus solely on technology, but on pedagogy or andragogy if you are in post-secondary. We believe that no matter how fantastic your technological tools are, inclusion to us is also about people and utilizing the experiences and the diversity of people to make your workplace inclusive. So Idea STEM, we have a staff of myself and my co-founder who provide subject expertise around how to support students with disabilities and trainees and professionals with disabilities in STEM based on learned experience and research. We do workshops and consultations on the topic. And for me, inclusive workplace learning really is built on the acknowledgement that each learner brings different things to that learning. They start at a different place, a different entry point to that learning, and hopefully everyone will end up with the same skills and knowledge at the end, but the path that everyone takes is going to be very unique, and diversity in workplace learning is all about different paths for me. So I'm going to pass it to Alwar.
Thanks, Ainsley. Really excited to be here, everyone. I'm Alvar. I'm the CEO of Fable. I'm an Indian woman in my early 30s. I have a skin condition called vitiligo, which reflects in having white patches across my body and including my face. I'm currently wearing a black turtleneck, glasses, and I have really long hair. About my company, Fable is a leading accessibility platform that's powered by people with disabilities. We help major companies and organizations move from worrying about compliance to building usable experiences for everyone. I'm really excited about this discussion. And for me, inclusive learning is simple. It's learning that is not designed for the average user. It's something that is, adaptable, customizable to each one of us in whatever format we want to learn. And I will pass it over to Galen.
Thank you, Alwar. Hi, everyone. I'm Galen Love, and I use pronouns he and him. I am wearing a light blue t-shirt and gray glasses frames with my long COVID hair up in a bun. Like many out there, I haven't had a haircut since before March 2020. And I had the pleasure of joining you all today from Toronto, Canada, where I serve as the National Education Product Marketing Lead at Microsoft. And I focus on empowering the full potential of students, educators, and administrators from K-12 through higher ed across Canada with the technology they already have access to today. I believe that technology elevates the education, employment, and living standards for billions of people around the world, especially people with disabilities. At Microsoft, our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And we at Microsoft are humbled by the responsibility and the opportunity before us to create accessible tools for billions of people all over the world. Like Sam and Anwar, to me, inclusive learning means solving for one and extending to many. Everyone can benefit from inclusive learning as everyone benefits from accessible content. Accessibility needs can be permanent, like being deaf, situational, like being in a noisy room, and temporary, like having an ear infection. All three of these scenarios would benefit from having closed captions for a training video. So it's very important that we think about building for some and leverage for all. And I'm going to hand over to Mahadeo.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or even good evening if you're coming in from someplace to the east. Welcome. Very pleased to be here with all of you today. My name is Dr. Mahadeo Sukai. I am the Canadian National Institute for the Blind's Director of Research and Chief Inclusion and Accessibility Officer. CNIB's mission is to change what it means to be blind through services, programs, and action. I lead the IDEA, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, and research teams at CNIB. And we contribute to this mission by understanding the lived experience and inclusion through primary data gathering efforts, that's the research part, and by teaching that understanding to affect organizational culture change, and that's the idea part. So unlike some of my colleagues on the panel, I'm going to take a slightly different approach to defining inclusive learning. Yes, I think it's important to recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all way of doing things. Everybody's lived experience matters. Everybody's journeys are different and unique. Inclusive learning instead is a recognition that one size fits one is a valuable way of thinking about learning. And I think when we think about inclusive learning in the workplace, we also need to think about the models of learning in the workplace, and what does learning look like today or feel like today? What's the experience like today? What's it going to be like tomorrow? What's it going to be like next year? What's it going to be like in a world that's been permanently affected by the past 15 months of the COVID-19 pandemic? And frankly, by the past 12 months of social change and social upheaval. And so let's actually think about this, that every human being has a lived experience. Every human being has a path to the way that they learn, a way that they work. And that those circumstances, as Galen has said, they can be very situational, they can change. They can be very environmentally focused. They can be very they can be permanent. They can be temporary. They can be progressive. They can be context dependent, and they are also dynamic. One of the things that I think is really important to think about that we often don't talk about when it comes to people with disabilities is that the lived experience is a dynamic lived experience. And so then when we think about inclusive learning in the workplace, we're thinking about one size fitting one, and we're thinking about that level of individuality and how to teach to it and how to work with it. So I think I have to pass the bouncing ball over to Alwar.
I love that intro. That was great. And I want to just kind of piggyback on a lot of things that you said. So we're going to dive into the first round of questions here. And I think before we dive in, like everyone in the panel has said here, learning is different. Learning needs to be unique. Learning needs to address individuality. And the way we think about it at Fable is that inclusive learning needs to lead to an inclusive culture. So the way I think of learning for us is at Fable is giving room to disagreement and debate, which gives room to diverse opinions and perspectives. Instead of saying, do we all agree to this decision? Like asking people to disagree, like who disagrees with this decision, and getting diverse perspectives in, and making sure we all are not agreeing to the same thing. We're not all thinking the same way, which I think gives room to inclusive culture. So the question that I'd like to throw at the panel is, what are the two most important things you think we can do in each of our organizations and workplaces to make learning more inclusive? This can be an action, this can be an activity, in whatever scale you want to speak to it. So why don't I pass it over to Ainsley to answer?
Thank you, Alwar. And certainly I'm going to continue with speaking about cultures of inclusion and how that's related to inclusive learning. The first thing I'd like to say is that same is not fair. We often think about same being fair, and in fact, it's equal opportunity, which doesn't actually look the same for every person. There's a cartoon or a visual that sometimes IdeaSTEM likes to use when we are speaking about these things, about three kids watching a baseball game, and they're all different heights. There's a tall child, a small child, and then a medium height child. And if you all give them the same height of box to stand on to watch the baseball game from over the fence or behind the fence, if they're a little bit shorter, then the really tall child doesn't need it, and the little child maybe doesn't have enough of height on that one box to get over the fence, and the middle child is able to actually use that one box to see over the fence. And so if we treat inclusive learning as same for everyone, not some people are going to get what they need, some people are not going to get what they need, and other people are going to have, more than enough advantage. And I think it's really important to remember that just because something is different doesn't mean it's not fair. Different actually can be fair. It's more focusing on equal opportunity rather than giving everyone the same thing. And if you do want to talk about sameness, you can talk about everyone needing to still achieve the same learning outcomes, so the same skills or the same knowledge you want everyone to have, but really recognize that the way that they are going to get there again is quite different. So in talking about that, we've all heard a lot about universal design for learning. And one of the pieces of that is multiple means of representation. But I think where a lot of us get this wrong is when we try and implement multiple means of representation for inclusive learning means that, maybe we're going to watch a video and then the next activity is reading something. And then after that, the activity might be physically playing some sort of game. I have no idea. But actually that's not inclusive learning, because you're talking about one skill when you're reading about it, and then you're working on another piece of content or skill when you're watching a video, and maybe some third piece of skill where you're doing an experiment or playing a game. And actually multiple means of representation need to be provided for every single objective. So it's not just a course that has multiple ways of learning, but it's a course that has multiple ways of learning the same objective. So a reading, a video, or an experiment that all three of them address the same learning expectation is actually more realistically what is going to make universal design for learning be implemented in a way that is actually going to lead to more inclusive learning. And so just being mindful of people's learning experiences, their learning styles, what they bring to it, all kinds of things about their experience can really help us as instructors or designers in the workplace for inclusive learning to really dig in and tap into each individual's unique needs and meet them where they are. Galen.
Thanks, Ainsley. Right off the bat, I think the most critical thing here is inviting persons with disabilities to help design the content, the training, and the learning paths. Really embrace the concept of nothing about us without us. The second one, it's really look no further than your own backyard. Leverage the technology, and in particular AI solutions, to provide the same learning opportunities for all employees. This can include cognitive AI services like captions and translation services, but also really great tools like the accessibility checker built into Office 365 and the products you might already use today, like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. By simply clicking this simple button at the bottom left corner of any Office 365 document you're working on, an AI will run behind the scenes and give you suggestions of how to make that document more accessible to everyone. The important thing here is that when learning content is developed, it's sometimes not developed centrally within the organization. It's diffused across the workplace to help bring that content to life. So really empowering every employee to understand how to make accessible content is critical. And most important of all here is making sure that all employees in organization understand that these tools are available. So yeah, I was actually at a great TEDx event, I think 2 years ago, where a really interesting concept was introduced to me, which is to think of the technology tools we use every day as teammates almost, right? Invest the time to get to know your teammates. Invest your time to understand the technology that your organization has invested in, so that if you are creating content, you will be more familiar with the tools that are available that might have been added to your technology over the past 2, 3, 5 years that you weren't aware of. And so if everyone's aware of these accessible tools and the technology they're using, whether it be accessible technology in Zoom or Google or Microsoft or even D2L, everyone knowing these tools are available will help everyone get accessible learning content. And I'm going to pass over to Mahadeo for his reflection here on 2 things to get started on today.
Thank you very much, Galen. So I have a couple of thoughts, and if there's time, I'm going to add a couple of extra thoughts. So I want to reflect on a point that's kind of been alluded to before, but not outright stated, which is that accessibility and usability are actually not the same thing. They're in fact 2 very different things. And I think it's important to reflect on this, because often people will say, well, this Excel file is not accessible to me, or this micro-credentialing learning course on the React principle and how to evacuate the building in case of a fire is not accessible to me. And the thing is that then when you test it, it actually ends up being accessible, technically speaking, to somebody who's using a screen reader or somebody who's using a screen magnifier. But you see, what the user is actually trying to tell you, but doesn't have the words for it, because this needs to actually be part of the inclusive workplaces training, is that it's not usable for them. And so I'm going to draw a distinction, and some of us will consider it a very fine distinction. I do not. I consider it a very large distinction between accessibility and usability, because usability needs to take into account how comfortable we are with the teammates, the pieces of technology that Galen just referred to. Right. And if we're not comfortable, if we don't know, for example, how to make JAWS or Microsoft Magnifier dance on the head of a pin, then it doesn't matter if the system is accessible. It's not necessarily going to be user friendly. And so when we think about inclusive learning in the workplaces, I think we need to think about the distinction between something being accessible and something being usable. right? Because something being usable makes it more inclusive. Something being accessible just points a direction. It doesn't actually set a standard. So that's one thing that I wish to say. The other thing that I wish to say in terms of this thought is and Ainsley alluded to a principle of universal design for learning in her particular reflection. And so Ainsley referred to multiple means of representation. I'm going to refer to multiple means of engagement. And this actually takes a level of awareness that not everybody has what I'm going to refer to as the same frame of reference. And so look, I'm an educator. I've been a post-secondary educator for actually all of my adult life. Frankly, now that I think about it, that's kind of scary. And so as a post-secondary educator, I will tell you that in the classroom, not every student knows everything. And so, for example, there's some cultures that don't play cards and some cultures that won't play poker. And so if you're trying to teach something and you're using an analogy of poker, right? Somebody who doesn't play cards, who doesn't play poker, or somebody like myself with a visual impairment who's not necessarily got the visual acuity to interact with a card deck or to play poker like that, we've got no idea what you're talking about, right? Absolutely no idea what you're talking about. And so then we actually have to think about multiple ways to have somebody engage in a concept, right? Whatever it is we're trying to teach, however it is we're trying to teach it, we have to recognize that we've got default assumptions as educators, and those default not even as educators, as instructors, right? Because most people in the workplace trying to do inclusive learning in the workplace are not trained educators. Right? We're all instructors. Only some of us are trained educators, right? But we have to take our preconceived notions about what people know and don't know, what they're aware of and not aware of, and actually realize that forms a set of biases around how we're teaching, right? And then it forms a set of biases around how we think people are learning, and we need to be aware of those. I think the last thing that I would say, just to poke a bear and see what happens, is that the accessibility checker in Microsoft is fantastic, but it does have one minor challenge, and that is that it can't read our minds. And frankly, AI can't read our minds. If AI could read our minds, that's either Lieutenant Commander Data of Star Trek, or it's the T-800 from Terminator, and I'd rather not the second, I'd rather the first, to be very honest with you, right? There's my one requisite science fiction reference for this session. I promise to hold all others. So here's the thing. We need to, as people who are doing work in this space, be intentional about how we think about things. And I just alluded to this with the frame of reference piece. And if we're not intentional, then we're going to run into a problem where the thing that is supposed to check our work, that being the AI-mediated accessibility checker, is not going to catch if we've made a mistake, because we don't even know that we've made a mistake because we've not thought it through properly. So I'm going to put that out there, and having poked the bear, I think I pass it on to Dr. Sam, and that is now my new name for you, Sam.
People at University of Toronto call me that all the time. So it didn't surprise me when the dean said that name. So it's wonderful coming in as the last person, because I have so many links to so many things other people said. I was primarily going to talk about inclusive culture and about accessible systems. So Alvar and Ainsley mentioned the importance of inclusive culture and diversity. I do believe as well that we need to nurture one. And I'm talking specifically about the workplace, where we are designing learning environments for people in the workplace. The reason why I think it's important is because of the empathy that is generated when a person actually meets somebody who's got a constraint and sees them struggle or sees them innovate. So empathy is very important for design. And when we design a learning system, there are three parts to it. One is the technology, which mostly comes from the vendor. And then the content, which is primarily the responsibility of the company. There's also pedagogy that ties the two things up. And both Ainsley and Mahadev had a lot to say about pedagogy. I'm a fan of universal design for learning, so I'm going to poke a little bit there as well. But let me go to content first. Accessibility of content, right? Galen said rightly about the amazing accessibility checkers that are there in almost every Microsoft product. I love the PowerPoint, the Outlook accessibility checkers. That's a great first step. But my thought, my thought there is these learning experiences are like they go beyond access. Access is like opening the gate, and then there's participation, and then there's contribution. So we need to definitely make access possible. And then beyond that, we need to also make sure that people who use assistive technologies or have other types of constraints are able to participate and are able to contribute. And that brings me directly to UDL. And you spoke about two principles. I'm not going to speak about the third one, but about those themselves. You were talking rightly, Ainsley, about multiple formats. Very true. For every single lesson or every single teaching point, there needs to be multiple ways of representing that particular learning. And learning systems or learning platforms that help with uploading of content in multiple formats, they allow that. But like you said, instructors might wrongly understand it. So pedagogy and training around pedagogy is very important. The only thing I want to say now before passing it on to who does it go to? Anybody remind me? Ainsley? Okay. Before that, Ainsley, I want to just say something about mindset. And that's got a lot to do with what Mahadev was talking. It's very important to capture the mindset of people who use assistive technologies. A person using a screen reader, for example, when they go into a web page, they'll first look at what's the title. And then they'll see what are the links and can I understand where this page leads me to? And then maybe they'll look at the headings and they look at the buttons. That's not the way I would look at it when I look at it visually. So unless you have people using these systems in so many diverse ways actually participate in the design, it's not going to be successful. And I'm conscious of the time. So Ainsley, please move it forward.
Thank you, Sam. That's a fantastic segue into the next topic. So I'm curious about the role of inclusive design to help facilitate inclusivity in workplace learning. And I know a number of people have alluded to this topic already. Galen said, nothing about us with us. And for me, the role of inclusive design, that sort of sums it up. So the role of inclusive design so that we can ensure and facilitate workplace learning is also inclusive for all people, is that inclusive design is very simply designing with us, not designing for us. And Galen very nicely summed that up. And it's extremely important to include people with disabilities in the planning and the development of workplace learning opportunities. I know that in healthcare, because I practice as a medical laboratory genetic technologist, in my local hospital, that there's a process development cycle that speaks to continuous improvement. And I think continuous improvement is really important when we're looking at inclusive design and inclusive workplaces and inclusive learning. And applying a similar method to this in all workplaces could really be useful. And things going through multiple rounds of adjustment and testing with people with disabilities before, a product is sort of finalized. And so with that, I'm going to actually call on Alwar because I know she has a lot of wonderful things to say on the topic of inclusive design as well.
Thanks, Ainsley. I love all the areas of learning that we're kind of touching. We're touching engagement, we're touching format, we're touching, like, there's so many parts to this. And so, I don't think about inclusive learning separately. I think about inclusive design and how do we apply that across our organization. And because it is a way of thinking, it is a practice that we should kind of try to weave into everything that we do, which is what's going to result ultimately in inclusive products and everyone's able to take part in society. So when I think about this, and I tie it back to the culture piece, because, you know, the way you build your teams is the way you are going to build products and what you're going to be putting out there. And one of the things that we did, you know, to make sure that, you know, we're building this inclusive culture where people can learn from each other, is we started, especially when we went all digital and we're no longer working from home, we started creating user guides, which is basically each person, each individual in our team would talk about, you know, how they like to be addressed, how they like to work, how they like to learn, how they like to get feedback, how do they like coming up with ideas, like all their preferences and individuality, which became so key when we moved to digital, so that any person who joined our team could learn about each and every single person in the team and how they like learning and how they like collaborating, which had such a big impact in making sure we still maintain that culture of like openness and debate and, you know, respecting each other's methods of learning. And I will pass it off to Galen.
Thanks, Alwar. So whether you're designing workplace learning content or engaging with your peers, customers, and partners every day in a meeting or in a document, anchoring on inclusive design ensures that everyone has a seat at the table and can bring their best self. So the three inclusive design principles we embrace at Microsoft in how we build products, but also how we engage with each other are: number one, recognize exclusion. Designing for inclusivity not only opens up our products and services to more people, it also reflects how people really are. All humans grow and adapt to the world around them, and we want our designs to reflect that. Number two, as I mentioned before in my intro, solve for one, extend to many. So everyone has abilities and limits to those abilities. Designing for people with permanent disabilities actually results in designs that benefit people universally. Constraints are a beautiful thing for innovation. And then finally, number three, learn from diversity. Human beings are the real experts in adapting to diversity. Inclusive design puts people in the center from the very start of the process, and those fresh, diverse perspectives are the key to true insights. And I'll pass over to Mahadeo.
Thanks very much, Galen. Nobody's said this as yet, but I think everyone's kind of alluded to it. Inclusive design's an active process, right? So I mean, everything that we've just said basically sounds like go and consult, right? And so, okay, I consult, I get a piece of feedback, and that's nice, and it's done with it. But then Ainsley alluded to the continuous improvement mindset, the process development sort of space, and that's actually iterative. It's circular, and so that means it's active. And what that ends up meaning is I'm going to listen to you. You're going to tell me something. I'm going to take that back. I'm going to modify my thing. I'm going to do it again. And then I'm going to come back to you again, and we're going to have another conversation, and then we're going to do that a third time until such a point as it's ready to go into the field. Notice that I'm not using the word perfect, because that doesn't happen, but until something is ready to go into the field. The other thing I would say about inclusive design is not only is it the engagement of the contributors and the consumers of the learning module or the learning practice, but it's also thinking about inclusion upfront. Inclusive design is not inclusion or accessibility as a bolt-on. It's born with, not grafted onto after the fact, right? And so what that ends up meaning is inclusive design is intentional thinking. It's a recognition that the human mindset I'm going to take that back. Not the human mindset. The North American conceptualization of efficiency and the Western European conceptualization of efficiency, which is by itself a cultural construct, and it comes out of the Industrial Revolution. It boils down to, you know what? I'm going to actually try to take the mass of humanity and create something that works for what I'm going to consider an arbitrary average. But you know what? I like stats, and I will tell you that statistically speaking, there is no such thing as an average human being. Therefore, trying to design something for such a thing as an average human being is a logical fallacy. And so what that means is when we think about stuff, we actually have to think upfront about designing for everybody, designing for people who are not the average, because the average doesn't exist. It's designing for edge cases. It's designing for scenarios that we won't necessarily think about because they're just not within our headspace. And you can experience this because if you take a look at, for example, the COVID-19 public health guidelines. The COVID-19 public health guidelines actually call out a number of places where somebody may be exempt from wearing a mask. But the people who came up with those guidelines actually are hearing. And the COVID-19 public health guidelines in the province of Ontario said that deaf people don't need to wear masks, right? But if you think about that, that makes precisely 0 sense. None whatsoever, right? But there it is, and that is because somebody who designed those standards did not think them through because they did not have the lived experience of trying to lip read, right? And so that is a current events ripped from the headlines real-time example of what happens when you don't embed inclusive design and inclusive thinking into the build of a process. And I think I get to pass this over to Sam.
Unmute. So once again, I get to go at the end. That's amazing. Thank you, Mahadev. And I would like to go back to the fundamental principles of inclusive design. Galen mentioned the Microsoft version of the 3 principles. I would like to remind everybody about the original, like Yuta Treviranus's Inclusive Design Research Center principles. The first principle of inclusive design is about recognizing and respecting the diverse needs of those for whom we are creating anything. So that's about diversity. The second principle is about including people with extreme needs in the design process. I would look at it as about equity. And the third is about being mindful of the larger systemic impact of our choices. And I connect that with implementing accessibility, and I'll tell you how. But before that, let me talk about something that I did when I was teaching the course on accessibility and inclusive design at the University of Toronto last fall. I positioned Yuta's principles as the core principles, and I positioned Microsoft's take on that as an amazing, amazing tweak to commercialize or to make it applicable to the industry, to make it understandable, especially the circle of exclusion. That's amazing. So I'll quickly go to how D2L implements these 3 principles. Like in our research, we include people with disabilities thanks to Fable, and thereby we try to cater to the diversity of opinions and feedback that we get. And by trying to try out different design explorations based on those pieces of feedback, we try to create different choices, which would sort of speak to the ensuring equity part of it, so that different people with different needs will get to choose what suits them best. And when it comes to accessibility or implementation of accessibility, that's about having a larger impact. I think we are talking about it ad nauseum here, but we have to keep repeating that what we design for people who have extreme constraints works for everybody. And to Mahadev's remark about there being a lack of perfection, I was reminded of Yuta's wabi-sabi principles. She'll always say about inclusive design that it's like we need to think about the 3 wabi-sabi principles. Nothing is perfect, nothing is finished, and nothing lasts. So with that, I think we will take it over to round 3, Mahadev.
Okay, there we go. That's better. I was muted for a moment there. So thanks very much, Sam. I get to ask the next question of everyone, which is, how can we authentically engage people with disabilities in the design of teaching and learning in the workplace? And before I pass it over to my colleagues on the panel, I'm going to offer you my perspective. And that is the most impactful way of doing this is to make sure that your workforce actually has people with disabilities who are experts on staff. Often when we actually have these kinds of conversations, what we end up doing is we end up saying, well, how do we engage a person with a disability as a consumer? As opposed to how do we engage a person with a disability as a contributor? Right, and I think we really need to step back from this notion that I've heard expressed in other places, on other conferences and in other ways, that persons with disabilities, Sam's used the term extreme constraints, and I'm going to back away from that a little bit because the problem is how we take up the English language. Constraints equals limitation. Right? Limitation means I can't do something. So if I'm engaging with you, I'm going to engage with you from the place of you can't engage with my my educational material that you have to engage with as a person in the workplace, not from a place of you actually know what you're doing, but from a place of limitation. And I wish to back away from that because that doesn't do me any good, right? And so, look, I work in an organization where 30% of the staff are blind or partially sighted. And the day I work in an organization, I used to do this, the day I work in an organization where I'm actually the only person with sight loss on staff, I don't want somebody coming to me and asking my opinion just because I'm blind. I'd like them to ask my opinion because I actually know what I'm talking about. Right? Which may come from some of my lived experience, but will also come from my professional experience. And so the best way to engage persons with disabilities, and by the way, let's also say intersectional identity here, the best way is to do so as equal contributors. Ainsley, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mahadeo. I agree. It definitely engage the diversity that you have within your workplace, and hopefully it's inclusive, but not every workplace is going to be representative of every single sort of disability experience or other diversity groups. And so I would encourage people to reach out to each other, to other employers, and to people who consult in the space like Fable and IdeaSTEM, and talk to us and let us, help you to recognize what you don't know and where you might not have anyone within your organization who can help you represent that particular aspect of disability, diversity around disability. But also, going to a couple of Mahadeo's comments, I think earlier around statistics, I think we need to be very careful when we rely on statistical data analysis and survey work from outside organizations, because those statistics are not going to speak to those ends of one in your organization that are still really important and need to be considered if you're going to be inclusive. So be very careful about how to use and apply your statistical data. Be very careful and pay attention in particular to what the statistical data is not telling you and what it's leaving out, and the populations that are not captured in that statistical data. Often you're going to get a positivity bias when you are collecting statistical data because people might be afraid of being fired or something if they speak out. And those are the people whose voices you need the most because they're probably the ones feeling excluded. There's a book by Adam Grant called Give and Take, and it's about the actual more we give to other people, it actually helps us to get further along and further towards our goals. And so I would encourage that as a read for anyone who is thinking, oh, like I want to get ahead, the market's competitive, I don't really want to talk to other people, and just flip the dialogue and tell yourself a different story, and recognize that by reaching out to other people and by supporting them around topics of diversity, you actually help yourself and your own business too. And the last thing I would say is about change management. So change is hard right now. A lot of workplaces do learning. That's sort of a one size fits all, and that is very exclusionary to individuals with disabilities or other individuals from equity deserving groups as well. And so when you are on the path to realizing more inclusion for your organization and the people in your organization, you do need to pay attention to change management, because we are humans, and at the end of the day, change is hard and it's uncomfortable, and you need to have a plan for addressing that discomfort. And that's all I have to say on this topic in the being mindful of time. So I'm going to turn it over to Alwar.
Wait, sorry. I was just getting a pop-up saying I couldn't unmute myself. I was a little confused there. I think this is really great. I agree with a lot of what Mahadeo actually said around, the best way to do this is by actually, making sure your team is diverse and has people with disabilities, like hire people with disabilities, make people with disabilities managers, have more responsibilities. And I think the other big thing is, can we have it so that, people with disabilities are not working on accessibility? I think everyone has unique experiences and unique skill sets. And I know a lot of people who live with disabilities in many organizations, and they're responsible for other things, and they'll always get asked about accessibility. I think changing that dynamics is really important. One thing I'm curious to hear everyone's perspective on, it's really important for us to have diverse teams, and that's how we're going to get to really be inclusive. But we have this whole thing around gender right now, and especially, I'm exposed to the startup space where, making sure that your board is diverse, making sure you have more female board members. And there's a lot of mandates for organizations to make sure, a certain percentage have women. And it's this idea of, making it more equal. But what is the impact of that? Like, what is equal? What is there a balance? What should we be working towards to have the outcome we want? I'm just curious to hear different people's perspective.
Galen,
Oh,
do you want to be the last one? No,
sure.
If you want to be the...
Oh yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, that's a really good call out there, Alwar. I think diversity, of course, is something that we all strive for. It's when organizations see the value of diversity, not for diversity's sake, but to be a better, stronger organization is really powerful. And so, Mahadeo, you actually mentioned that your workforce should be diverse. That's an important part for your diverse and inclusive journey to create and celebrate accessible content for learning design, which is also, Ainsley, you put out a book reco. I love a book reco. I was holding my tongue, but I have a great one if everyone's interested. It's called Technically Wrong, Sexist Apps, Biased Algorithms, and Other Threats of Toxic Tech by Sarah Wachter-Boter. Definitely recommend that one. A lot of sad examples of where technology got it wrong. When people are developing tools that are used all over the world by every human, essentially, who has access to technology, but the designers of it are white, cisgendered, from the West Coast of America, there's a lot of opportunity for failure. And especially with the advent of AI, there is an incredible need to make sure that there is diversity, whether it be from gender expression, sexuality, or accessibility. Really important here. But to summarize here, like, ensuring accessibility is built in and not bolted on, something that I think Mahadeo referenced to as well. Of the disabled community is to engage in design of workplace learning is critical here. However, diversity is just the seat at the table. Inclusion requires that all members of the learning design team at that table are empowered to voice their ideas and are valued and heard for their contributions. I would also add that it's important to not have the expectation that is the responsibility of those who need support to source and provide it. It is a partnership. And I'll pass it to Sam there.
Thank you, Galen. So for those of you who want to enjoy a video version of Sarah's thoughts and ideas, There's a TED Talk, amazing examples of, I think the chocolate example and the Facebook alt text. And yeah, I won't go into that because I have more important things to do, like accepting my folly to Mahadev about talking about constraints rather than differences. I have this thought in my head that when you have a bell curve, there are two sides to it that are not average. Taking an example of students, there's the student who fails and then the student who gets more than 100%, technically. So when you flatten that bell curve and when you get a human scatter plot, sort of, who's there at the edge? There's not just people there's different types of people at the edge. I don't even want to name anybody. So that aspect of looking at differences is very important. So we need to very carefully choose the words we use. And sort of continuing on the same strain, like Alvar, you were talking about treating people with disabilities in a work situation as human beings who contribute their thoughts and other things, rather than just calling them for, hey, you screen reader user, okay, can you come and check this website? I totally understand that. The other thing, especially with your talk about the board members and all that, is what Mahadev talked about regarding intersectionality. Right? So what is the identity that you want to float on top? And which one, maybe for different forums and different contexts, you want to use different parts of your, like Mahadev has that famous thing about the complex identity that people have, the different facets of it. And I don't want to go very far because I don't want to go too much over time. But what I actually wanted to do was to talk about how we actually do whatever I was going to talk about. That is, what was I going to talk about? How do we engage? How do we authentically engage people with disabilities? Good that I noted it down here. So we need to engage people with disabilities way early in the design phase. And that's what we do. We have people with disabilities in our company, as well as we bring people through Fable. I'm repeating this again and again, but I wish everybody uses Fable. So with that, I think, Galen, could you take over? And, oh no, we have an audience questions sound, right?
Yeah, I think we're going to do some audience questions, and then we'll give some wrapping thoughts from the panel saying what they believe in.
So are there any questions?
Hi, Sam. Yeah, they've all been sent to Jax.
Sam, I've just put the first question there in the chat for everyone.
Oh, okay. I'm going to read it out for everyone. As accessibility professionals, what would you say are starting points for inclusion of people with invisible disabilities? Amazing. Particularly with the increased reporting of mental health challenges in post-secondary environments. Anybody wants to take that?
It's Ainsley. I can speak to that a little bit. Thank you very much for that. It's an excellent question, and definitely people have always struggled with mental health and mental wellness, but the recent COVID-19 pandemic has not made mental wellness easy for people. I think often, especially in STEM disciplines, but generally all over in all workplaces, there's this pressure to be well and to not share when we ourselves might be having a bad day. We might feel ashamed of feeling, sad or under the weather, whatever it is that we are feeling when we are feeling uncomfortable. And when we don't share those feelings, they actually perpetuate within our bodies and they get stronger and the shame gets stronger. But talking about them can actually make us feel lighter and give our students permission to tell us how they're feeling as well. So I think staff and instructors and educators, policymakers all need to talk a lot more about mental health in the workplace and specifically how they're feeling to provide the example to make it safe for other people to respond the same way. And there's a lot of people struggling right now, and we really do need to be having those connections and check-ins with each other and being like, how are you doing? Now, how are you really doing? And being open and not judgmental and honest to having those conversations.
Yeah,
that's wonderful. Yeah, Galen, please.
To jump in here, I'm not sure if the perspective is coming in from an educator or administrator or from a student, but in any event, I think what's really important here is to engage in dialogue. Where there isn't a conversation, there isn't an understanding. So to have, I think an organization like a post-secondary institution or K-12 institution should be trying to find ways to understand, to seek to learn, to ask probing questions, to really anchor on socio-emotional learning, to understand, especially in really complicated times with remote learning, how can an educator check in with students to get a pulse of how things are doing? How are they managing and accessing this content, this data, and trying to address it? How are they tracking it and bringing up the curve of student well-being? So it's not just about asking it once. It might be asking it every week or every day and logging responses. So looking in some tools that you might have access to might be really helpful to probe questions. And it could be things like in a Zoom call or a Teams meeting or a Google Meet. How are you feeling today? Put in an emoji, put in a GIF, like share how you're feeling, and just take a pulse of the room and listen.
So it's Mahadio. I'm going to add to Ainsley's and Galen's comments. I'm going to tell you a story. A number of years ago, I was doing some work with another organization that was interested in doing a wage subsidy program for persons with disabilities who are recent graduates from post-secondary. And the question about disclosure and identification came up. And in chatting with the HR director from this organization, they said, well, 90% of people with disabilities have visible disabilities, so we don't have to ask anyone to disclose because we will know, right? Funniest thing I ever heard at the time. And I said, well, actually, no, the numbers are inverted. 90% of people with disabilities have disabilities that you actually cannot pick up on just by looking. And I'm actually going to offer here, because I loathe the term invisible disabilities. I also loathe the term visible disabilities. And so I'm going to offer Mahadio's definition. You will not find it in a textbook. I can't give you a book recommendation on this, although I very much appreciate Ainsley's and Galen's book recommendations, and I would love to read those books myself. So here's the thing. A disability that is not visible because somebody is not using an aid, a service, a canine, some other service animal, or another human being, or a piece of technology that renders the disability visible, right? And so physical disabilities and sensory disabilities tend to be categorized as visible disabilities, and everything else tends to be categorized as invisible disabilities. But in reality, of the 1.5 million Canadians who are blind or partially sighted, only 10% of them use a white cane, right? And I think it's like, I don't know, 0.05% use a guide dog, right? And so what is that? That is a minimalistic fraction of a very large population. Everybody else, doesn't have a visible symbol of disability. And so I think I'm actually I'm going to answer your question by questioning the premise of your question. I think what we need to do is we need to step aside from this preconception that disability is something that someone can visibly interact with, which I personally can't because I have a visual impairment. But instead, what we think about is that everybody's different, right? And if everybody's different, we start building policies recognizing that everybody's different, as opposed to building policies that start from a fundamentally flawed misconception.
Galen, are you able to give me a minute, or you want to, because it's 2:50?
Yeah, I think we have time for a wrap up. Maybe let's allocate 5 minutes, but there's a second question in here. I think it would be worthwhile to focus on that and try and keep wrap up.
I can quickly summarize a couple points for the second question, which is recognizing technology isn't always a magic bullet. What sorts of strategies can be used to help transition people to online systems? Now, I'm not coming at it from the educational institution's place. I'm coming at it from the place where the technology is designed and the experiences are designed. There's a need for understanding the mindsets and the goals of the users in the online environment, and making sure that the design is simple and directly speaks to those needs. And second point is not to blindly replicate any real world processes, but to certainly examine what could be the best way of doing those things online that would make the adoption easier. Over to you, Galen, further.
I'd actually like to jump in there.
Sure.
For that one. I think, with COVID, a lot of us have been, forced to just work online completely. And online setup, each of us have set up our computers in the way that we like to work. And the thing that I've seen work really well is actually taking that time with every new person who's joining, help them set up their tech that the way it'll work for them. There are tools that, the company is using and the team is using, and there's a way of using it, but making sure that, the individual and the way that tech is set up is actually works with their mental model. And it seems like something really simple, but being organized on your computer is directly linked to productivity and the way you can participate. And I think taking that time to help set up tech for people is going to be really key, and not assuming that every single person's tech skills in your team is one thing that we've seen work really well as well.
Awesome. So I think we're wrapping up here. If there are some additional time, maybe we can take another couple of questions, but I want to give the panel the opportunity to wrap their perspectives off. So for myself, I believe that in order to achieve the change in the workplace that we all desire is not achieved by the committed few making policies and technology investments. It is achieved when every person in the workplace is aware of the why and the how. Technology is a tool that we all wield. We have the opportunity to empower us as individuals, but more importantly, technology is a tool that we can use to empower each other. Accessibility by design is a priority we all should be committed to together. And I'll hand it over to Ainsley.
Thank you so much, Galen. I am going to be very brief here in the interest of time. I'm just going to build on what you just said, and I think we need to change our values. This often people will rule out an accommodation in the workplace for someone, whether it's for learning or productivity, because of this notion of efficiency, so cost efficiency or time efficiency. And we need to actually either change our definition of efficiency or change the values and the tools that we're using to help create accessible workplaces and accessible workplace learning. Ultimately, this is about people, and it's about why and how we do things for us. And I'm going to call on Alvar.
This has been really great discussion, lots of thoughts, lots of areas of inclusive learning to digest and think about. Where I'd like to wrap it up from where I would like to see this go forward. I think learning is often seen as instructor imparting wisdom or knowledge to the learner. I would like to see that change more to peer-to-peer learning. We learn a lot from each other, and I think if learning is framed that way, and if education is framed that way, we would be in a different situation. And I will pass it over to Mahadev.
Thank you, Alwar. So we spent a lot of time talking about inclusion. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about learning, but Alwar is quite right. I think how learning evolves in the workplace, particularly after we get through the third, possibly fourth wave of COVID-19, whatever comes next kind of thing, that's going to change. And we have to think about what that means, right? Is it one directional? Is it omnidirectional? One directional is teacher to learner. Omnidirectional is everybody is playing an equal part in the process, which is what we tried to model with this panel, which hopefully folks picked up on. But the other thing, though, is, and we haven't talked about this either, and this is a whole nother conversation, is two things: leadership modeling and workplace culture and employee buy-in. And those three things have to play off of each other. Because you can have cynical employees who don't buy into what the leaders are trying to model. You can have the leaders not buying into what the employees want. And you can have cultures that could go awry because of all of that. And when it comes to inclusive learning, you absolutely need that synergy between employee buy-in or among employee buy-in and leadership modeling for a workplace culture. And I think I pass it to Sam.
Thank you, Mahadev. And I will talk a little bit about learning as well, since you mentioned that. The future of learning and the future of work, both of them are intertwined. I was just thinking about it, like, why is it that we have people with disabilities? I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but it's because the education system where somebody has to do a 4-year undergrad and a 2-year master's in design to become a designer is not that accessible to a person with a disability. So as a result, you don't have designers, you don't have the jobs for designers going to people who actually could contribute as a designer and not as an accessibility tester. So by changing that, by helping the education system transform to allowing small bits of learning to be consolidated for a bigger degree and allowing upskilling, reskilling in the workplace and making everything inclusive, making learning at the workplace inclusive, I'm sure we'll have less references to disabilities because there'll be more designers, more developers who inherently have lived experience and they will be directly able to influence the accessibility of products and services. With that, I think we are at the close of this amazing, interesting panel. We still have 2 minutes if anybody wants to jump in. I looked at the third question. It's how do we authentically engage people with lived or living experience? This is something we discussed during the panel, but if somebody wants to take a different or nuanced stand, you're most welcome.
It's Mahadio. I kind of read the question as how do we find people, as opposed to how do we authentically engage them? Because we did talk about the authentic engagement. I think that I think that it's in an organization where 30% of the workforce is blind or partially sighted, and something like 35 or 40% identify with disabilities generally, sometimes it's actually easy to forget that in most workplace cultures, you're probably looking at somewhere around 1 person in 150 who are blind or partially sighted, right? And so 1 person in 150 versus 1 person in 3, basically. And when I say that, it sounds like, well, CNIB doesn't have anything to teach the world, and I disagree. We have a lot to teach the world. But I think what it ends up meaning is, if we have $1 in a day, where do we put the effort, kind of thing. And so we authentically engage by seeking out, by listening, by doing everything in our power to empathize and understand, and by using that knowledge in an iterative, meaningful way to make reasonable change, but to do so recognizing that persons with disabilities, persons with intersectional identities are equal parts in the process. That's what authentic engagement means.